Welcome to webinar on COVID-19 and its disruption on global supply chain management. I am Nick Vyas, Executive Director, Center for Global Supply Chain Management at Marshall School of Business, University of Southern California. And it is my pleasure to introduce my esteemed panel, Dr. Hasegawa, Dr. Theodore, and Mr. Krensenstein. What I would like to do today is, along with my panel, is just to sort of lay the land of how we see the disruption on supply chain and what is this virus can impact overall network design for us. So agenda for the day today is sort of a background on the situations and what is the current situation. And we want to touch on the impact on global supply chain management, right? And then we'll certainly touch on how that relates, the disruption in supply chain will impact the global economy. And certainly we will talk about plan of action briefly and question and answers. So that's, with that agenda in mind, what we will not be able to do is forecast how bad this can get or how unscathing that all of these issues that we can just come out as a humanity. So none of us here are really extremely good at forecasting, even though we're part of supply chain professionals, but we're not going to forecast things that we do not know, nor anybody knows, the situation of the virus and its impact beyond what we see to the data that we have and what global supply chain network has become over the last 20 to 30 years. So with that, let me get started, the origin, right? So what is COVID-19, right? And I know Dr. Theodore will actually go through it, but as we know, coronavirus, COVID-19, started in China, and certainly now we're seeing that it has actually penetrated across the continents, across countries. And I will let Dr. Theodore really get into the subject of what it is in much more sort of a medical perspective on this virus. But let's look at the current situation. If we see that from January, and this could be actually as late as December, it started to pop up in China, in Hubei province in Wuhan city, right? And then now we've seen that truly over last several weeks, it has really ramped up. But if you see the shade underneath the blue one, that we are now seeing the evidence of that outside of China. And the screen that you see are the rising number of cases and countries. We're now seeing that this has certainly penetrated across all the continents and over 80 countries. So let's look at the global supply chain network. I think we often lose the understanding how interconnected we have become. And what I want to highlight here is to the right of your screen, when you think about the OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiative, right? Over the last 15 years, there has been significant efforts being made to sort of connect land bridges, waterways, airways, in sort of creating this One Belt, One Road. So when you think about this, the global interconnectivity, it is obvious that situation like COVID-19 can be linked to how this global connectivity we're working together. So it's not only this networks flows the goods and the data and the financial information, but it also has a human flow. Businesses props up, travel, and all of those associated. So you can sort of look at that interconnectivity and how this becomes then the courier in terms of spreading the virus. So when we look at the global supply chain network, we really have to look at individual nodes. The raw material, it has its own supply chain. Suppliers, manufacturer, distribution, customer. Each of these nodes, if you were to look at it, it actually creates its own infrastructure network of supply chain. What we're seeing in this event, that every single node has been somewhat disrupted, one more than the other, but we are seeing the impact of disruption across each of these major nodes. Dr. Hasegawa and Mr. Kranzenstein will actually explain more, but we're seeing the losses already started to pile up, right? We've seen shipping industries in a very first month, booking losses over $2 billion. Chinese ports to Rotterdam's has seen the decline of volume in 20%. We've seen some of the industries, auto, airline, high-tech sector, manufacturer, suppliers, and supply chain companies. Every single one of those verticals have seen the impact of this virus and disruption. Port of LA, certainly we've seen that last month, 25% reduction in volume, and Dr. Hasegawa will explain more on San Pedro Bay and how they're handling this situation. So this one question that I wanted to really bring this up, because often the conversation is, well, but we had this SARS in 2003. Why is COVID-19 different than that? So I wanted to highlight by just pointing out, let's compare the GDP of China back in 2003 to look at where GDP of China and in its prominence in the supply chain network nodes in 2020. As you can see, China has become from number 7 economy to number 2 in 2020. So not only when we look at China as an export, but also the import, because the rising middle class creates a traffic flow for the freight and cargo, both ways, outbound as well as inbound. And that is certainly why this COVID-19 has a greater impact on the disruption than did SARS. So we have seen the financial markets. We've seen the early estimates of GDPs coming out of countries, right? Some countries obviously has a significantly more impact than others, but it'll be premature to say that Eurozones or US and other countries may not see a significant impact because China, obviously where it started, and as you've seen in the previous slide, there was a tremendous uptick on the number of incidents and number of fatality. So if we look at it in terms of the industry that we see, right? Tourism, hospitality, aviations, automotive, oil and gas, consumer product, consumer electronic, and semiconductor. And you can go on and on and on the spectrum that it will have some impact. And the duration of those impacts will depend on the vertical that we are affiliated with. So with that, what I would like to do is invite Dr. Theodore to come and provide us the medical perspective on the COVID-19. So Pierre, thank you very much, first of all, and appreciate you taking us through the journey to the medical lenses.
Thank you, Nick, and I'm delighted to join you today, and I think you did a very excellent job in really setting the stage for a discussion, not just about the biology, if you will, of COVID-19 and its anticipated effects over this cold and flu season, and then potentially subsequent cold and flu seasons that will come, but moreover, the impact that it's likely to have on many elements of business practice. So what I thought I might do is, just so that we have kind of a common understanding, is ground us in some current understanding of the epidemiology of the disease. I would also start off by pointing to the JAMA Coronavirus Resource Center, which is referred to at the bottom of the slide. It is a superb source. While written for clinicians, it really is a presentation of data around COVID-19 that is particularly accessible. It updates virtually by the hour. And some of the data that I'll present to you today is literally from this morning. And I think this is a good resource for all of us. The first thing is to note that there are sometimes some differences in terminology around the disease. COVID-19 is effectively the clinical condition, where SARS-CoV is the agreed upon terminology for the virus itself. It should be noticed this is a particular type of virus, which is a single-stranded RNA virus. This is important in that it has a lot of homology with previous SARS epidemic viruses that have struck humankind during the 21st century. The most notable of which would be the SARS-CoV-1 virus, and then secondarily the Middle Eastern respiratory virus in 2009 and 2012, respectively. And I point those out because each of those previous infections or epidemics with COVID or coronaviruses give us some insight into what we might anticipate with the current novel strain. That said, it must be noted that this is indeed a novel human virus to the best of our understanding, which means that previous infections with coronaviruses and any other attempts at vaccination are not valid with respect to the current SARS-CoV-2 virus. As of present, as you're well aware, and as you mentioned, Nick, roughly 90% of the cases at present are in China. And however, there are cases at this point that have spread to 50 countries, and with each day, another country is, quote, coming online with additional cases, what appear to be also with a lower overall case fatality rate, which I'll refer to in a moment. I should mention that the primary means, perhaps unexpectedly, for the transfer of a respiratory virus such as CoV-2 is via large droplets and often by direct contact with a mucous membrane, eyes or nose. That said, droplets and spread of the disease also appear to be found in stool and in blood as well. So we do not at this point fully understand the transmission pathway for coronavirus. I should mention, as of right now, there's been an extraordinary explosion and a foreshortening of the development approaches from the pharmaceutical industry to bring, for one, up to 100 different clinical trials of varieties of antiviral therapies in combination, many of which has drawn from treatment strategies around HIV or the Ebola virus vaccine, which in some ways has given us a template both for epidemiology management, but also drug development. Next slide, please. So this is just an update as of this morning. There are roughly 90,000 cases of COVID-19 that have been confirmed. The term confirmed, to be clear, represents the use of a PCR technology to confirm the presence of the specific COVID-19 virus. There are a series of other coronaviruses that exist every cold and flu season. Roughly about 35% of all colds are caused by a coronavirus, but not the COVID-19 novel virus that is the source of the discussion for today. You can see that nonetheless, with 80,000 plus patients in China, the overwhelming majority has been found in mainland China, with of course, a recent increase in numbers in Western Europe and Italy in particular, and a growing number in the United States. To the right of the screen is an important factor around the COVID virus. And the key issue here is the likelihood of infection. You can see, for example, in the lower right, where there's a very high degree of spread from a given carrier represented by the yellow circle to those around. The anticipated number of patients infected by a single given patient with coronavirus 19 is somewhere between 2 to 4. What is unusual in this case is that there appears to be a lot of variability in the asymptomatic period after infection, with that asymptomatic period ranging between 1 up to 25 days. This is important because for such a potentially long period of incubation can thwart quarantine measures and make it difficult to contain the disease. The next slide, please. I did want to leave you with this. This is data that's been presented by the Chinese CDC. And the reason why I point this out is that you can see that there truly is a spike of cases and now what appears to be a diminishment of cases within China itself, which would suggest, at least in the short term, that we're not looking at a logarithmic ongoing increases of cases in China. It is true that the Chinese health authorities took very extreme measures, which may not be taken elsewhere, so we cannot necessarily assume that this early spike and reduction in number of cases will be the same worldwide. I should also add, of course, that in addition to solid information, the best tactics that we have to combat coronavirus largely relate to standard hygienic practices, such as increasing the rate of hand washing and a reduction in the amount of unnecessary contact, particularly in the cases of large meetings of, for example, 1,000 or more, where many countries at present have clearly put into place regulations to prevent large gatherings of persons with the assumption that will result in ongoing spread of the virus. I'm going to pause there, Nick, to see if that gives a bit of a sense for where we are now. There are many details that we could go into about the epidemiology of the disease and those who incur the greatest risk of mortality. I do want to end on one last comment, which is that in the New England Journal of Medicine 4 days ago, there was effectively a comprehensive paper done of 1,099 Chinese patients who had PCR confirmed COVID-19 with a case mortality rate of around 1.4%. So it appears the early suggestion of a case mortality rate of 3 or 4% may be significantly higher than what we're actually seeing in the real world with respect to the risk of mortality. I'll pause there. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer, or perhaps we can move on to the next portion of our discussion, and I can answer questions towards the end.
Well, Pierre, thank you very much. And I think you're one of the very small population of medical doctor who also understands the supply chain. So let me just interject the question that came in specifically that relates to medical science, but also applies to the supply chain, which is if the virus can survive on the regular surface,
yes,
how does this impact on a refrigerated container, which is obviously 68°F? Will the virus survive on the refrigerated goods, or there is a temperature sensitivity with this virus that only stays at the room temperature?
Yeah, there are two issues in hearing that question that I have taken in. One is the question of its capacity to exist on a surface for a longer period of time. And the best evidence that we have across a variety of coronavirus, remember that there are 4 classes of coronavirus: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. So in some ways, we have a fairly good sense overall what the biology of coronavirus and its life on a surface outside of a human body without a vector is relatively short. And while we don't know specifically with COVID-19, we're looking at far less than 1 day of capability of a virus to survive on a flat surface, if you will. Almost assuredly, viruses are cold or are sensitive to temperature. I don't think we have enough data right now to make a particular claim about how COVID-19 would respond in the setting of refrigerated materials being shipped. That said, viruses tend to be very temperature sensitive. Part of the reason why we see a little bit of change in infectious rate season by season. There are other, of course, epidemiologic issues about people spending more time inside and connected with others in colder months, but there appears certainly to be an impact of temperature on the function of the virus.
So Pierre, I have one particular question for you, and then we're going to move on to our next guest, and then we'll take a lot more questions at the end, including my participants. Please submit your questions on the Q&A chat, and staff is actually collecting those questions as well. So Pat, the question was from one of our participants: can pets get the virus? Is the reverse true, that it goes from human to animal?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. To the best of our knowledge, this is a novel human virus at this point, which means that it is almost assuredly a zoonosis, meaning that the virus at some point was established likely in a bat species. It's not entirely clear. The intermediate species is also not clear, but at present we believe this to be a human a novel human virus, and therefore of little threat, if you will, to be transferred from human to, house pet, for example.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, Pierre, thank you very much. And please stand by and then we'll take the Q&A as it comes. Noel, please introduce yourself a little bit and then give us a perspective, San Pedro Bay, and how you guys are seeing the impact of COVID-19, and give us some understanding from your perspective.
Sure. Well, Nick, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your leadership in assembling this webinar. I think forums like these provide opportunities for us to share with each other what we're seeing on the ground, and also gain some additional insight on how we can collaborate and best address some of the impacts of this issue. For those in the audience, my name is Noel Hasegaba, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Director, COO at the Port of Long Beach. It's a pleasure to be here. As many of you know, the ports are the tip of the spear. Anything that ripples through the supply chain has a way of touching us first. And what we've seen so far in relation to the impact of the coronavirus is pretty obvious. In fact, on one of the slides, if we transition to the first slide, Nick, typically around this year, because of the closures of the factories in China, there's a period of about 2 to 3 weeks where we see a slowdown, and there are a number of blank sailings. These are ships that are canceled from the schedule. This time around, when you look at the number of blank sailings, at the top of this matrix, you'll see that for a typical period like Q1, between the two ports, Long Beach and Los Angeles, there are about 300 calls. So far, we've seen 56 blank sailings that have either taken place or are announced. So as a share of that, about 20% of our scheduled calls are now considered blank sailings. In the box below, you'll see the actual number of blank sailings, and this compares Q1 of 2020, which is in the middle, with the same period last year. And as you can see, for a typical year, you see about 20 to 30 blank sailings. In 2019 Q1, we saw 33, and already for Q1, we're looking at 56. So you're looking at an almost doubling effect. And what that means is, as I've said many times, goods movement is the economy in motion, and when goods stop moving, it starts having a ripple effect across the supply chain, and including the local, regional, and national economies. For those of you who are interested in a national perspective, this number grows to 80. So across the nation, there are 80 blank sailings for the first quarter. So obviously, this is going to have a significant hit on our performance as ports in terms of how much cargo we handle. On the next slide, you can see that illustrated. For the Port of Long Beach alone, year over year, January, we were about 5 points down. It may not seem like a lot when you consider the baseline, which was January 2019. January 2019 was already depressed as a result of the tariffs. A lot of shipments were advanced, and a lot of shipments that typically hit January, February, March actually entered our gateway at the end of 2018. And so compared to an already depressed month for January 2019, minus 4.6% is not good. For the month of February, we're looking at 8% decline year over year for the month of February. When you look at our sister port, the Port of Los Angeles, their declines are more pronounced. The reason for that is because they have a couple extra services that call their port from China. But in addition, their baseline, which is January and February 2019, was higher. So as a result, Port of Los Angeles is anticipating about a 25% decline year over year for the month of February. Combined, both ports will certainly experience double-digit declines as a result of these blank sailings. If we go on to the next slide, just to give you the bigger picture, we have effectively transitioned from trade uncertainty to coronavirus chaos, and without any break in between. And with the trade uncertainty and the tariffs that were put into place, we saw here at the Port of Long Beach a decline in our imports to the tune of 20.5%. What was interesting is that we saw other regions such as Southeast Asia, we saw gains on the import side to the tune of 14.5%. We believe that this is part of a broader trend, something that has begun and has been in motion for some time. We believe that some of these shocks in the supply chain may actually accelerate that shift in manufacturing from China to Southeast Asia, countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, et cetera. But as you can see, the numbers reveal and they reflect the fact that this shift was accelerated as a result of tariffs. We believe that the impact of the coronavirus and the effects on the supply chain may actually help to accelerate that trend as well. The next slide shows a similar analysis on the export side. And for those of you in the audience, you may know that the ports of LA, Long Beach, given our geography, heavily reliant on Asian cargo, China in particular. Long Beach alone, about 50% of all our businesses with China. About 70% of our imports come from China, and about 50% of our exports go to China. And you'll see there that exports to China were down about 26% for calendar year 2019. But on the bright side, to some of these other countries and regions, we actually saw a double-digit increase. The next slide, again, going back to the bigger picture, this is what concerns us. When you see these shocks to the supply chain, it makes shippers nervous, and it makes them think about and consider risk mitigation going forward. And what we have seen in our gateway, which is the largest gateway in America, historically, the ports of LA and Long Beach have accounted for about 40% of waterborne imports. You can see on this chart that as it relates to market share, after peaking, and I'm pointing you to the gray line there, which accounts for both the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. In the year 2006, our market share peaked at around 38.5%. And that's a number that we continue to use today, but in reality, when you look at our actual market share, you'll see that that peak has fallen to where we are today, which is 30.7%. So effectively, in a span of about 14 years, we've lost about 20% in our market share compared to other gateways in America. So when you think about some of these shocks to the system, you think about how this is rolling throughout the supply chain, it gives us some pause. The other thing I would mention as well is, in light of some of these blank sailings and the impacts to the supply chain, the Trans-Pacific trade lane, there have been some strategic decisions that some of our ocean carrier partners have made that we believe are related to the coronavirus, but go beyond that. I think these are strategic realignments. So just in the last month, we've heard that PIL, which is a Singapore-based ocean carrier, is pulling out of the Trans-Pacific altogether. We're also hearing that there might be more decisions along those lines, which means that there's going to be further consolidation by the lines, and that effectively results in fewer ship calls. And what concerns us about that is that it means there's more higher concentration of cargo on every ship call, and it ensures that we're going to have a mini peak every time we have a ship. So to the extent that we can, we're already preparing ourselves here in Southern California for the boomerang effect. And that is, once the supply chain is stabilized, once factories in China reopen to 100% levels, once employees are allowed to go back to work at the ports of origin, we expect a surge in cargo in the months ahead. So we call that the boomerang effect. At some point, there will be a recovery. And in a typical year, that recovery lasts anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. We expect the recovery here to last a little longer, depending on the rhythm of the cargo as it makes its way to our port. But that's another consideration. That's definitely something that we're working with all of our partners to prepare ourselves for, and that's a surge in cargo. So, Nick, with that, I'll end my formal presentation at this point, but of course, happy to take any questions from either you or the audience at the appropriate time.
So Noel, we'll take the more questions in the back end, but there are specific question that came that I would like to have you address. So the first, obviously, you mentioned the decline in export, right? So this is not just an issue of import not coming in, but also direct correlation of China facing this crisis, but the exports are down. How do you see this impacting the local economy, especially in Southern California, for that matter, California, and overall for the US in terms of the export?
I think it has the potential to have a dramatic impact. When you consider what exports do for the local and national economy, it fuels businesses, it creates jobs, it spurs economic development. One of the impacts we're seeing already is when these ships cancel their voyages, it means that containers are not coming inbound. And typically when we see imports come through our gateway, those imports are sent back to Asia, to reposition back to Asia, either as an empty container or as an export. When you see the number of blank sailings piling up, it effectively results in fewer containers to reposition those products back to Asia. So that's one thing that we're monitoring very closely. We're looking at the system imbalance between inbound and outbound containers, and the fact that there's a shortage that is growing by the day. But beyond that, Nick, I think to your question, the inability of China's middle class to continue their consumption of American exports, it remains to be seen if this is going to be a longer trend. We hope that this coronavirus, once first and foremost, the human impacts are contained or eradicated altogether. We hope once the supply chain is back in motion, that the middle class in China will continue to demand and consume American goods. To us, that is the real question. It's all about the demand. Once the supply chain gets back in motion, we believe that the system will eventually find the right balance, and there will be enough equipment to be able to send American made products to Asia and China in particular.
Thank you, Noel. And this goes to, and this question really open to all three of you. And Dan, I know you are next in terms of giving your perspective, but this question also applies to you. So I would love to have Pierre, Noel, and Dan provide the perspective on this question. So, I teach this class called Global Supply Chain Management in International Settings. And one of the classes where we take our students to Singapore and Malaysia, we often talk about the role of government, the governance, the transparency, the soft infrastructure. What have we learned from this incident of COVID-19? That companies often don't truly emphasize the value of making their network design decision in a holistic way, but simply tend to focus on the cost. Do you see this event, an episode that we're currently dealing with, will change that, and other factors will become equally important as the cost has been? Noel, we'll start with you, then Dan, and then Pierre. From your perspective, I would love to hear as well.
Sure. Well, Nick, from my perspective, we've all experienced and underwent two back-to-back disruptors to the supply chain, right? Trade policy, and now we have this coronavirus. What both have managed to do is expose the fragility of our supply chain. And what we believe is going to happen on a going forward basis is shippers, in an effort to try to manage the risk, are going to start considering alternatives. We've been reading in the newspaper recently about manufacturers based in the US, for instance, that are repositioning their manufacturing plants from overseas back to America. And I think you're going to begin to see more efforts along those lines to try to control their destiny, if you will, and try to manage those risks so that they can, to the extent possible, mitigate or avoid some of these disruptions altogether. But I think in general, the fact that we've had these back-to-back disruptors, if you will, a lot of shippers and a lot of folks in the supply chain are going to go back to the drawing board and think about how they can best manage the risk going forward.
But so Noel, do you see the lack of transparency early enough on these data points coming out of China sort of created this problem to be a little bit in a state that it is today? And is some policies such as that is meaningful consideration for supply chain design?
I certainly think that's an element in all of this. I think broadly speaking, the lack of the unknown or the fear of the unknown, not having a view of the complete picture creates a lot of paranoia and hysteria, if you will. The fact that we've had information on a piecemeal basis, whether it's tweet by tweet or headline by headline, I think feeds into that hysteria. So yeah, I think transparency and confidence in the information that's being shared about this situation is central to how we think about the supply chain, our strategies going forward.
Thank you. Noel, Dan?
Yeah, so I would add that your question was based on cost. And digging a little deeper, you're talking short-term cost, long-term cost, and the cost of risk. So historically, American companies compared to Asian or even European companies, American companies are quarterly driven, report to stockholders on a very fast pace. So what have you done for me lately? How are our profits lately? How are you controlling your cost without taking into effect planning for risk? And clearly, the new norm is disruptions, whether it's global warming, whether it's pandemics, what have you. So to not take into the cost of risk or the variable of risk and has this increasing would be silly. So therefore, when you look at cost, if you don't take that into account, I think you're being very short-sighted. So we know risk is going to happen. We know there's going to be disruptions. If you don't take that into account, then you're going to be hit with a sudden surprise, which you haven't planned for, and your costs will go up even higher.
So, but then to that point, how much of the role of the government and governance plays into that consideration?
Good point. I mean, clearly, the trade friction between U.S. and China was a disruptor. Clearly, COVID-19 is a disruptor. I guess what I'm alluding to is there's going to be more and more, and there's only so much the government can do. A lot of it is in the hands of the private sector to take vessels out and have blank sailings, to follow the demand. So as demand drops and there's less space on the ships, I really don't know what role government could play from my perspective, at least.
Okay. Pierre,
my only comment I would have to add to that all is that it does speak to the importance of truly reliable sources of data around this sort of the epidemiology, spread of the disease, and the overall health impact with respect to human capital. And I say that because, not surprisingly, we were struggling with sources of data coming from all levels of competencies, and it sometimes can be difficult to get real sort of clear information. I would say that the CDC has done a superb job, and as I mentioned earlier, both the JAMA and the NEGM data resources do allow us to get a fairly clear picture on the development of the disease, which I think is core to this, is transparency and availability of reliable information.
Thank you, Pierre. So before I move into, let me come back to it, but then let me actually get you on. Dan, thanks again for being with us. Give us your perspective.
Sure. If you could just go to my first slide, that will see me off. Thank you. So what I try to do is, from a global supply chain perspective, try to say, what does COVID-19 mean to somebody who's a practitioner, who's deciding whether to place a purchase order in China, Vietnam, and India, and how to manage chaos in each location, because that's what we do. Global supply chain practitioners, we manage chaos. Every day we wake up and we say, all right, what's today's crisis? And it's almost like you look forward to it as a problem solver, and you don't shy away from it because you're the professional who's in the best position. Might be wrong 50% of the time or 30% of the time, but you're going to get it right more than others would. So chaos is what we do. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with China, primarily with respect to supply chain, but not only. And what I mean by that is China's the first hit with respect to US importers, which is my perspective. And when it comes right down to it, it essentially means instead of a 2 to 3 week delay, which is the normal Lunar New Year impacts, you're looking at a 4 to 6 week delay. Most of our China suppliers are already back up and running as of 2 days ago, 3 days ago, some of them last week. But on average, I'd say I'm around 30 to 50% capacity with most of my suppliers. And certainly by the end of March, hopefully by, let's say the third week of March, we'll be at 80 to 100% production at most of my suppliers within China. What the question marks are these going up a level to their suppliers. For example, my polypropylene bag suppliers, where are they getting their liners from? Their suppliers of polypropylene and polyethylene, are those being delivered on time? So that's where I'm still trying to gain clarity on the variables affecting my suppliers. So again, if you want to put numbers to it, I'd say essentially a 2 to 3 week delay, which is predicted, has now doubled to a 4 to 6 week delay, hopefully. The other point about China is no matter what, it's still dominant. It's still a key source of products coming into North America. And I don't see that shifting away immediately. Maybe on a 5-year perspective, it's just another peg to knock China down and say, all right, it's no longer going to be the world's manufacturer. It's going to spread out a little bit. This is certainly going to edge away at China's dominance, but I do see China remaining dominant for the next couple of years. The domino effect, what I mean by that is, especially for Southeast Asia more than South Asia, especially for Vietnam, for example, as opposed to India, Vietnam still relies on China components and China raw material. It's where it gets its fabric. It's where it gets its components from. So with China factories shutting down for 6 weeks as opposed to 2 weeks, that has a knockdown effect on Southeast Asia, most of the ASEAN countries, in getting their components. The other knockdown effect, or knock-on effect, if you will, or the term the domino effect, is those blank sailings that Noel alluded to. And for those not familiar with the shipping industry, a blank sailing is essentially an ocean carrier, a Maersk, an MSC, an Evergreen, a Costco, had planned a weekly service from point A to point B, and they decided to take one vessel out and mothball it, or it's cheaper to not sail it than to sail it, so they're going to skip a week. So what happens to the product ready to sail from Ho Chi Minh to LA? It basically has to wait another week. And then when it comes to that week of delay, there's too much supply versus demand, demand versus supply. So therefore, there's a lot of rollovers. A lot of containers cannot load on that ship. And we're facing that presently in India on several of those shipments that we have trying to ship out of Mundra into New York because of the knock-on effect of too much cargo shifting to India and vessel skips. Therefore, we're having cargo roll, which is not a good thing for us. And the final macro comment I wanted to make before I go to my next slide is this is more fuel for the fire for those anti-China, or if you want to call them Trump hawks, if you will. We're trying to decouple from China. This is just one more piece of ammunition for them to say we should bring cargo back to, if not United States, at least to Mexico. And even though it's going to be more costly in the short run, when you add in the cost of doing business with China, this is just further fuel to move in that direction. And the final comment I wanted to make is economic effect, that no one is spared the pain. That you're going to see it when you go to the Target stores, the Walmarts, et cetera, in about 3 weeks to a month from now. You're going to find shortages of the products that you want to buy as an American consumer. You're going to find some empty shelves of certain products you want to buy, and that's going to cause inflation, and it's going to cause disappointed consumers. Already on Amazon, you're finding some products are taking longer. Obviously, the hand sanitizers, the masks, the gowns, the stuff that out of concern you want to buy, those are already in short supply, and inflation kicks in because those go to 3 to 5 times more expensive if you can buy them, let alone do you even need them. That's a separate question. Next slide, please, Nick.
Yeah, so then just to interject a point there,
Sure.
that inflation and shortages for the protective gears and the commodities associated with those SKUs have already seen the inflation upwards of 40 to 50%.
Absolutely. So what I try to do here is give 10 pointers or best practices, if you will, from my perspective on, as a supply chain professional, what it is that you should be doing. First off, as Dr. Theodore Pierre had commented, be careful on your sources of information. Make sure you're using trustworthy sources, whether it's CDC, JAMA, or elsewise, and don't just trust what you read on social media, because a lot of it are false rumors. Try to get firsthand information. And for us, It ranges from my factories to my QC auditors to my forwarders, and I have an internal risk mitigation team on what sources of information do we trust. For example, I will ask my factories, what percentage of your workers, because in China, most of the suppliers are along the coast. It's Guangdong, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Fujian, Jiangsu, all the way up to Shandong. A lot of the physical workers, the blue collar workers, are domestic migrant workers coming from Henan and Anhui and elsewhere from the interior hinterlands of China. Well, a lot of them have not been able to come back to work yet because of quarantines and because of fear. So as a result, every year after Chinese Lunar New Year, you always find a shortage of workers. And this year it's exasperated, so that only now are the workers coming back. So my first source of information is talking to the factories and saying, where are you? What percentage of your workers are back? Where are you in terms of capacity? And where are you in terms of the raw material and the components coming into your plant? They probably want to paint a rosy picture in terms of being in charge of things and a pessimistic picture in terms of lead times, so they can stretch us as far as they can and can get away with. And this is typical. That's the typical supplier constantly type of relationship, a cat and mouse game. I do trust my QC auditors that are going into the plants to check on my merchandise to make sure it's per spec, and they will give me accurate information in terms of what production is in process. They get into the actual production planning. So that's an alternative source for me to find out what's really going on. I talk to my forwarders to find out, are the truckers operating yet? Are the ports open? Are the vessels having blank sailings? And one piece of advice I keep getting from all of them is make the bookings early. So in other words, if one of my suppliers typically makes the booking a week prior to vessel sailing, they're suggesting make it 2 weeks prior. Give more of your forecasting more transparently to your forwarder so they can make bookings for you and revalidate them if they get canceled. And it's just a better coordination is required at this time. And then internally, I do speak to the owner of our company. I speak to our US general sales manager and speak on a very frank basis of what I'm seeing, what they're hearing, and cut through the rumors and get to the facts of what we do know, because we know it better than others do. In terms of risk mitigation, obviously keep more inventory. That's true for us. That's true for our suppliers during times of risk and chaos. The more inventory you have, your costs go up, but you have a little better control. The China plus N used to be called China plus one strategy. Now it's more referred to as China plus N, meaning multiple sources. For us, we already started shifting to India about 3 years ago because of cost alone. And that turned out to be a good move on our part, because not that we're immune to what's happening now in China, but with majority of our production in India, it's less of an impact. We have other variables we deal with in India than we didn't have in China, but not this particular one. But this forces the importer's hand in terms of make sure you have alternative sources, especially to lean on during times of chaos out of China, if you will, to mitigate your risks. Again, back to the coordination, the S&OP coordination. It's very important to give your clients a realistic, regular assessment of what's going on so that you become a trustworthy source of truth versus fiction versus rumor. And so making sure your sales team is not overcommitting and setting the expectations realistically, I think it's quite critical. I think internally it's important to prioritize, because you can't solve everybody's needs all at once during times of chaos. You can't get every product manufactured at the same time or on the ship as urgently as the other. So really have a prioritization within your company of who are the most important repeat clients, which are the highest margin, and however you want to assess it's up to you. But it's important to know which clients need to protect at all costs, including air freight, and which ones unfortunately can be expendable. It's important to be agile and trust your field ops team to have workarounds in place. Whether if you have a 40-foot container, a 40-foot high cube of 8,000 units in it, but you realize it's not all going to be produced on time, and you have to go to the expense of a 20-footer or shipping LCL to get it out of Asia and on the way to the United States, go ahead and make that decision. An occasional air freight shipment, or perhaps a sea-air combination, or a tag team truck to take it from port to an inland destination like a St. Louis, you normally wouldn't go to that expense, but these are not normal times. And you might have to go to extraordinary solutions, which cost you money, but which your clients appreciate. It could be a good move towards agility. Internal staffing, my staff in my Shanghai Asia regional headquarter office have been away from the office for, we're going on 6 weeks now. And as a result, I had to up the speed of their internet at home, give them database access to their home computers, and set up conferencing capabilities that we had in the office, which you don't have at their homes. So we've had to do some internal workarounds. The last 2 points are the famous bullwhip effect. Be careful not to overorder like everybody else does. Keep your numbers realistic, because you could be sure others are doing the same and you don't want to be caught with excessive inventory. And finally, the last point, which you don't want to lose sight of, is jihui. So in Chinese, it's opportunities do develop through times of chaos. So look at your strengths. And in this case, we happen to be sourcing from India. That's a unique market strength we have right now, the not immunity, but less risk exposure than those who are wholly reliant on China. We are using that as an opportunity to expose our clients that, hey, I think we're better off than our competitors might be during this time of chaos. So look for those opportunities where your strengths shine through during times of chaos. That's what I wanted to share at this point. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Dan. So I think let's get into the Q&A. I've actually just received a bunch of Q&A through the live chat. Let's start with the very first one, and I'll actually just chime in my perspective. How do you think the coronavirus will impact US-China trade war in both the short and long term? I think, again, going back to my slide about the global integration, and the purpose of me sharing the OBOR slide was that China is going to be a sizable force, both in terms of consumption and in terms of the participation, in terms of providing raw materials, in many cases, component and goods. So I don't think that decoupling is possible, but running completely two separate parallel supply chain, we do not see that as a realistic option. So I think it'll be, at some point, pull and push, we'll come to some equilibrium, and as a society, we will learn to say, can we share the supply chain, both in terms of digital platforms and physical platforms, for the good of the humanity? So now to that question, hopefully that answers the questions. I'm going to move into, Pierre, there are a couple of questions that your input would certainly be appreciated. So the first question was, the Spanish flu in 1918 initially calmed down during the summer, but it came right back in the fall. Can we expect the same behavior of a COVID-19, which obviously we're moving into the spring and the summer, that it'll probably have a head fake of downtrend and then show up again in the fall?
Yeah, it's a critical point. You know, the true answer is no one knows, of course, for sure. And in fact, viruses are not static, which is to suggest, particularly these single-stranded RNA viruses, that they can mutate. And in fact, they can become more mortal or more infectious over time. It is almost assuredly the case that we will see a diminution in the number of coronavirus cases through the summer. But I think it's truly speculation. That point being made about the Spanish flu is absolutely correct. There was almost sort of a honeymoon period, and then the subsequent cold and flu season, there was a significant amount of mortality, as everyone is aware, through the subsequent cold and flu season. The issue really is really twofold. One, we do have current antiviral therapies that do show some promise in treating acute and severe disease with COVID-19. And the second is the nature of the mutations that develop over time. This becomes relevant when we talk about creating vaccines, and you will often hear politicians and pharma execs alike talking about the time frame for potential vaccine for next year. We are probably looking at somewhere between 12 and 18 months. The vaccine is more of an art than a science. Some of these vaccines are going into phase 1 trials, that is treating normal people within the next several weeks, but it will be months upon months before we've been able to measure the antibody response, and then also the durability of that antibody response. So the answer is, we can anticipate the coronavirus, the COVID-19, this specific virus will come back, but it's impossible for us to speculate as to the severity and the sort of second wave of the disease.
So the question, the other question was in terms of the incubation that we talked about. It could be from 1 to 14 days is what normally it's been used, but it's up to 21 days.
Right.
So think from the supply chain standpoint, is that incubation only true for the human species, or can it actually survive in the cardboards or cargo coming across the Asia Pacific?
Yeah, and we have to extrapolate a little bit in terms of, as I said, we have to extrapolate from other coronaviruses, and there are significant differences, even just, if so, you know, the alpha group versus beta, gamma groups of coronavirus do differ in their properties. What we do know, there's two issues that you've spoken of. The first is the potentially prolonged incubation period between the time of infection of a patient and when that individual is actually going to have symptoms. That's important because that means you can have a long period of asymptomatic and then potential spread of the virus. That's one of the concerns around coronavirus specifically. And moreover, it tends, unlike flu, to more frequently present without fever initially. So it can be hard to identify the condition early on. Specifically with respect to the survival of coronavirus on flat surfaces outside of the body, it is very variable based on temperature. So we do know that at colder temperatures, let's say 4 degrees Celsius, you know, sort of in the 40 degree or so range Fahrenheit, that the viability of the virus can actually be quite long. When it's typically just, you know, room temperature, 86 degrees or so, somewhere in there, the survival of coronavirus on a flat surface tends to be quite short, somewhere between 1 and 3 days. There's a lot of debate about this, but I definitely think that it's important to bear in mind that low temperature shipped items can potentially have a durable and persistent presence of coronavirus that can last for several days, last for many days.
Thank you, Pierre. So there was a question in terms of universities. Is incoming batch of 2021 for undergrad or graduate students into universities will have an impact? And what I can speak of what we're doing at the business school and the University of Southern California, that there is at the president's office and the dean's office of the business school, they're looking at all these different various scenarios and really creating some action plans and mitigation strategy, how to work with the current situation. So to answer the question about incoming batch of 2021 and how this will be impacted, universities, we're working diligently to come around and come up with the solutions beforehand. The last question that we will take, and I'll open up to all my panelists here, is, again, you know, I prefaced this in the start of our webinar that we're not going to forecast this, but just likely scenario from your perspective. Just let's talk about a common man and a woman. What should they do to protect their family while these issues we're discussing goes on? Pierre, we'll start from you, then Noel, and then Dan.
Yeah, you know, I don't think there's a rocket science to relate in response to this. I think there's three elements I think are important. The first is standard basic hygiene practices, of which there are a variety of sources to kind of make it clear as to how we should manage ourselves in terms of hand washing, avoiding additional intimate contact when not required, particularly around very large crowds of greater than 1,000. So I think having that in mind of sort of avoiding very large crowds and hygienic practices is probably the cornerstone. The second is at least having some knowledge, at least in the US, as to what your local public health authority, where the local public health authority is and how to reach them, so that severe colds and flus are then only in that small group that are presenting with significant symptoms are capable of being screened with RT-PCR tests for diagnosis for coronavirus. I would say those three items in my mind are sort of the, you know, for the traditional or sort of the standard person to adopt as a defensive posture against coronavirus.
Thank you, Pierre. So what this basically says that what we have seen now, the trend of large conferences being canceled, we will probably continue to see this as a sort of best practice.
I think that's the case.
Thank you. Noel.
You know, along the same lines, some of the actions we've taken here at the Port of Long Beach is We have suspended travel, for instance, to international travel, try to keep our employees safe, away from harm's way. But like Pierre said, I think practicing common sense, not overreacting. We're telling our employees that if they have a fever, if they start showing any symptoms, stay home, and we'll find a way for them to continue to be productive from the safety of their home without necessarily impacting other employees. And so that's what we're doing. We're also trying to provide our employees with as much information as we can from legitimate sources. I think keeping everyone informed and making sure that they know that we're informed and we have the best interests at heart will keep things calm in our organization.
Dan?
4 points. One, always be compliant with local laws. For example, in China, if they say your office or your home is quarantined, follow it and don't try to break it. Secondarily, make sure you can trust your sources of information as factual. Thirdly, prioritize internally which accounts you'll jump through hoops for, whether it's air freight or LCL or whatever you have to do, production. And finally, just continue to communicate both to your suppliers as well as to your clients with the best information you have, so you become yourself a trustworthy or credible source of information.
Thank you. So let me just sort of reflect, first of all, and by giving my sense of gratitude to my panelists here, Pierre, Noel, Dan, thank you so very much. All of you that participated in this webinar, thank you. My closing comment is that we as a human species have become very globally interconnected. We'll continue to do so, although we have a narrative sometimes, they may appear to be contrary to the view of globalization. We feel, and I personally feel, that we have made significant impact and progress by globalization. We'll continue to see that. The reshuffling of supply chain network is natural. We will see that decoupling will happen, but in the long run, it will be very integrated, very holistic supply chain network that will continue to optimize the best opportunities with the hope that sustainability and protecting our earth will also become a part of the future supply chain designs. With that, I want to thank you. I want to thank my team at the Center for Global Supply Chain Management for helping me put this webinar together, and we will be posting the recording on our website. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day, and be safe.
Thanks.
Right on.
Right on.
Thanks.
Have a good day.